I'm Caleb Kidcoy, Epic Legacy Hero Builder, and I'd like to welcome you to Living Like a Bank. Along with myself, you'll hear from other successful experts and people who are busy serving and empowering many lives. You'll see how we're showing others to become debt-free in record time as they build economic discipline while generating a bulletproof family legacy revenue stream together. We'll learn how to live and operate just like the banks do. Hey, ladies and gents, Caleb Kidcoy back at you again. Your alchemized slayer of mediocrity, heroic family legacy builder, and host of Living Like a Bank podcast. We are back with some more grins and shirks and whatever other kind of faces will be made in discussing 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. And law number 8, make other people come to you and use bait if necessary, Mr. Chris. Bait and hook. I mean, are we really doing that kind of nasty marketing here? What's going on with this, Chris?
Why is it nasty? It's just advertising. It's advertising. It's marketing. It's.
You sound like a marketer, man. You're supposed to come at us from a non-marketer perspective.
It's getting attention, man.
It's about getting attention. There it is.
What did the single person need to do to get a date? What did the unemployed person need to do to get a job? What did the contractor need to do to get a gig? Right? You got to use bait. So I mean, I don't think it's a question. Obviously, you got to go out and hustle. I don't think that's even the question. That's just too obvious to even talk about for a podcast. But I think what he's saying here is, do you want to be direct, or do you want to set a trap? That's what we're really talking about here. We're not talking about whether you need to hustle and be brazen if you want to sell anything or do anything or produce anything, whether it's art or business or anything, you got to go out there and you got to hustle and you got to do things right. But how are you going to do it? Are you going to take a direct approach? That's what we're really talking about.
It really is. So when you force the other person to act, you are the one in control. So it's always better to make your opponent come to you, abandoning his own plans in the process. Lure him with fabulous gains, then attack. You hold the cards.
Right. So, we've had a bit of a theme throughout this podcast series of talking a little bit about tennis and chess, which I do think are pretty good examples of with strategy and power, right? Because let's just pause for a second. What is power? Power is applied force, right? And we're talking about power in a social context, right? Not nuclear power or, but in a social context, it's applied force of getting other. So I've heard it. I forget who said this, maybe Zig Ziglar or something. I forget who said it, but sales is, or persuasion is, getting other humans to act in a way that you want them to act using only words. And sales is one example of that, but so is dating, so is relationships, so is parenting. In every walk of life, we're trying to, if we're not completely self-absorbed, we're trying to do two things. We're trying to figure out what other people want from us, and we're trying to give that to them. And then we're also trying to be what we need to be to deliver what other people need from us, right?
That's right.
And so for that second part of it, where we're basically trying to get people to sort of give us credit for what we're doing, so to speak, that's where we're trying to get people to come to us. So going back to chess, if anybody's played chess or even just heard of the show Queen's Gambit, and we've talked about this in a couple other podcasts, but white moves up to the most basic, obvious place in the middle of the board and black matches him, then white appears to make a mistake. Now, here's the example on this law, though. We've talked about that previously. But the way black can defend that is actually typical of the Napoleonic battle tactic, which is and I was talking about in the core tactics of Napoleon. Napoleon created the core system. As a matter of fact, we talked about that in the last podcast. But the unique thing about the core system is they could spread out all over the territory so that the enemy couldn't tell where they were. And then when they found the enemy, they'd converge. So the point being that the first core to engage the enemy, the point is that the core had to be strong enough to engage a whole army and hold the point of attack. Sort of like a good first serve to get them off balance, right, Caleb? Okay.
Right.
And then, so once that corps holds the point of attack, then the other corps would organize to come in and basically envelop and flank on both sides. So kind of like with tennis, like you get that, well, it doesn't matter. It could be a body serve, it could be down the line, it could be out wide, any of those three, but you get a good one. Now you've got them sort of pinned, right? And you've got them off balance, and now you're in control. Now, and so the last game of chess I played, I set up basically a triangle, which if you want to get really nerdy is called the Slovak defense in chess, okay? And so this Slovakian defense, I ignored the white gambit. And so the white gambit ended up getting distracted, and my triangle there was basically my core that was absorbing the white attack, and there was some melee, and then I ended up being able to bring my horse and pawn and queen and capture the white castle with half of their flank never even being able to move. They basically took the bait. I like laid out a castle. They tried to siege my castle. I defeated them in the field, and then I took their castle. But I think that's an example, right?
Yeah, that is a great example. And in talking about Napoleon Bonaparte and his military and strategic ingenious and success, right? It's interesting that they finally had to, the only way they could get this guy cornered was they had to exile him essentially. Now you love this story, Chris, right? But I mean, again, how many times did he, position himself where, there was just no way that in his mind that he knew he could not succeed, and people had to eventually figure out, okay, we got to do something different to corner this guy.
Well, they gained up on him. It basically took all, and they had
that was the only way. Yeah,
they had to, and once wasn't enough. They had to do it 5 times. They were called the Wars of the Coalition. So there was the War of the First Coalition, and there were 5 of them. So,
right. And Michael, pull that text back up if you would. This is a little European history here. At the Congress of Vienna in 1814, the major powers of Europe gathered to carve up the remains of Napoleon's fallen empire. The city was full of gaiety, and the balls were the most splendid in memory. Hovering over the proceedings, however, was the shadow of Napoleon himself. Instead of being executed or exiled far away, he had been sent to the island of Elba, not far from the coast of Italy. So the guy had made such a name for himself. I mean, his very name just brought awe and terror and a whole plethora of emotions, really, right, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, everybody outside of France wasn't very fond of Napoleon, obviously.
You think?
The real point of that story, though, was making other people come to you and setting a bait trap.
Yep.
So Napoleon's basically I don't know if chief of staff is quite the right thing, like Michael had talked, but Talleyrand, okay? Talleyrand was a very important person in the Napoleonic sort of court. And Talleyrand was a very, basically, like you could think of him like a chief of staff or something like that. He was Napoleon's right-hand man. But about 5 years before, in about 1809, Talleyrand had privately lost confidence in Napoleon, and with good reason, having just read Napoleon's biography. Napoleon really started to, in my opinion, I'm just quoting what the author Andrew Roberts said in his famous biography of Napoleon, but he divorced his wife, he started to get fat, he started to drink. Famously, Napoleon had never been a drinker earlier in his life, and he'd been in pretty good shape, out in the army, but he started to get fat. He had always had mistresses and stuff, but he gave up his original wife and made an arrangement for marriage and didn't have that support of any real love because he just had a political marriage. So even though he and Josephine had a conflict, like any other relationship, but he had a real relationship. And then when he lost Josephine, he only had a political marriage to somebody who didn't actually really care about him or give him any kind of real emotional support or anything. So he didn't have that real wife. Okay, even though he had a legal wife, and he was less and less listening to any other people, and he was engaged. He had lost all of his navy. He couldn't really challenge Britain, and he foolishly got drawn into the war in Russia. If he had just hung out in Poland, he probably would have been cool if he hadn't tried to go into Russia, right? So anyway, all that said, we're not trying to retell the whole Napoleon story, but Talleyrand has lost confidence in dude. Napoleon didn't know that. So the real point of that story in 1814 is Talleyrand thought that Elba was not nearly far enough away, because he was really, really, like you said, scared of Napoleon.
Yep.
Everybody, a lot of people who weren't in France were scared of Napoleon. And so instead of trying to force the issue, he worked behind the scenes to get to make other people go to Napoleon and tell him lies that everybody in France loved him, and they basically arranged it, and like they made it look like he escaped. Like let's go Game of Thrones reference, right? We've all remember in Game of Thrones when I got to remember the name here. Michael, I might need a helpline assist here. Great Greyjoy. Theon Greyjoy, right?
Greyjoy, yeah.
When Theon Greyjoy escapes, but doesn't really escape from Ramsay Bolton, it's kind of like that, right? With Napoleon, because when Napoleon escapes from Elba, it's really a trap by Talleyrand to make him come to him. And Talleyrand predicts everything that's going to happen after that. Napoleon comes back, starts a war, gets his butt kicked at Waterloo, violates all of his principles of war and military operations, divides his troop, ignores all of his own principles and everything, and ends up being sent off to St. Helena, which famously is farther from anything else than anything else is from anything else.
Right. And I like this quote by Otto von Bismarck. When I have laid bait for deer, I don't shoot at the first doe that comes to sniff, but wait until the whole herd has gathered around. And here in the Keys to Power, the whole image is the honeyed bear trap, right? Bear hunter does not chase his prey. A bear that knows it's hunted is nearly impossible to catch and is ferocious if cornered. Instead, the hunter lays traps baited with honey. He does not exhaust himself and risk his life in pursuit. He baits, then waits. Bait, then wait. Bait, then wait.
That reminds me of my favorite funny story my daddy told me when I was a growing young man. So there's two bulls up on the top of a hill, a young bull and an old bull. And they're looking down, and there's some of the most beautiful female cows anybody's ever seen down in that pasture. And the young bull is pretty excited, and he says to the old bull, "Hey, we should run down there and we should get us one of them cows." And the old bull says, "Nah, son. Now listen, we're gonna walk down there, and we're gonna be nice to all of them."
There it is. Good old father-son story to relate to it. How many times has the scenario played itself out in history? I mean, again, we went through this example. An aggressive leader initiates a series of bold moves that begin by bringing him a lot of power. Slowly, however, his power reaches a peak, and soon everything turns against him. His numerous enemies band together, trying to maintain his power. He exhausts himself, going in this direction and that, and eventually collapses. So, another great example from a historical standpoint. And what else, history-wise, Chris, did we kind of highlight in this particular law that stood out to you?
I can give another military example of setting a trap. In Alexander's famous first engagement against the satraps of the Persians, they're along a river, and Alexander's actually slightly outnumbered. And keep in mind here, he's like in his early 20s. He's like a college kid, right?
Right.
And he's out there leading like 15,000 men against 20,000 men. And it's important to understand that the Macedonians, unlike the Greeks, who had short spears and a small shield called a hoplite, and so those hoplites had short spears. What the Macedonians did is they basically created long pikes that were significant, like 3 times longer. And so they had massive formations, and importantly, it was really inexpensive. They could cut down a couple trees and have a few iron points, and you could have a serious army. But it's not very mobile, and it's extremely vulnerable to being attacked from the flanks and behind. So you have to have the hoplites and the companion cavalry on the flanks to make this system work. So along the river, Alexander basically sets this trap for the, no pun intended, satraps.
Mm-hmm.
And so he attacks with his main cavalry, his elite cavalry force, right across the river. It looks like a suicide attack. And the Persians are like, look at this stupid, how young is this kid? Who does he think he is? He's just going to come across the river and just attack us? But he does. And it's not going particularly well. I mean, he's sort of holding his own, but he's buying time for his main force of these spearmen to come in and cross the river, and for his other cavalry to come around the backside and flank him, and he utterly ruins the Persians. So it's kind of similar to the Napoleonic principle.
Right.
They engage him at that point of attack, pin him down, then bring in their other main force, and now you're looking at a wall of like 7,000 guys with 18-foot spears marching at you. Like, in that era, there's nothing you can do but run.
Right.
You're screwed. And it all happens so quickly that the Greek reserves, I know it sounds kind of confusing and I'm not misspeaking, there were Greek mercenaries who were being held in reserve, and everything happened so fast that the Greek mercenaries weren't able to even come up and support, and then they were surrounded and massacred. Yeah.
That is not the kind of war situation you want to find yourself in. Greene tells us everything depends on the sweetness of your bait. Sweet bait. If your trap is attractive enough, the turbulence of your enemy's emotions and desires will blind them to reality. The greedier they become, the more they can be led around. So that kind of highlights some of those real life examples. Michael?
I was thinking a complete different direction in terms of circling back to the beginning when you started the conversation here talking about advertising and kind of taking it away from military and war tactics and kind of more back around to business. I mean, one of the most successful baits in advertising history to set a trap, the Happy Meal. The Happy Meal, the creation of McDonald's in the 1970s, that got kids in with the promise of a meal specifically for them and a toy specifically for them. And once you got the kids in, you got the parents. So, parents were then trapped for the remainder of their child's childhoods into having to buy McDonald's on a regular basis, to get the kids in because they had been trapped by that Happy Meal. I mean, that's one of the most successful baits in history.
Absolutely.
Great example. And actually, that's somewhat true of every restaurant everywhere. A lot of restaurants I've heard and been told, not that I run a restaurant, but they barely break even on like the food and overhead and everything. And all the money comes from the drinks, right? So it's sort of like a loss leader, and you want people to come in and get drinks and stuff. So, yeah. So, I mean, when we again, as we've talked about many times, Caleb, Greene's being controversial and edgy and provocative, and good for him. He sold more books that way. I'm not being critical, but there's other ways, less controversial ways to say the same things he's saying that are actually pretty basic, right?
100%. And kind of wrapping this up as we bring it to a close, talking about the reversal, although it's generally the wiser policy to make others exhaust themselves chasing you, there are opposite cases when striking suddenly and aggressively at the enemy so demoralizes him, his energies sink. Instead of making others come to you, you go to them, force the issue, take the lead. Fast attack can be an awesome weapon, for it forces the other person to react without the time to think or plan. With no time to think, people make errors of judgment and are thrown on the defensive. The tactic is the observe of waiting and baiting, but it serves the same function. You make your enemy respond on your terms. And I think in this modern day and age, Chris, and this business world filled with competition and noise to distinguish and separate ourselves, there's really opportune times for putting that reversal into effect, where you recognize, right, here's my window of opportunity. Instead of baiting somebody in, let me go on the full marketing offensive, right, and capitalize maybe on an area of weakness or maybe oversight of another organization or company that they miss. What do you think?
I think everything has a rhythm, right? And just last night, I was watching the Women's World Cup, and Japan was playing Spain. Both teams have been really exciting coming in, scored tons of goals. But Spain came in, and Japan stacked their back line. They had 5 girls back in front of the goal, and then another 4. There's only 10 on the field, okay? For those who don't follow soccer a lot. So they're stacking the back end, and they've got one really fast girl out front. And you're thinking, oh, they're just being conservative. Not really. Pardon me. Because what they did Spain came in and they're trying to pass it around, but there's nowhere to go. There's 9 women standing there in front of the goal. They're never even threatened. Sooner or later, they turn it over. The Japanese kick out a long pass, and they've got this really fast girl out in front. Japan ended up winning 4-0.
There you go.
Invited them into their trap, let them turn it over, and then counterattacked.
There you go.
I think you could give us a tennis example, right? Like you're playing off the baseline, right? Setting them up, and then there's that winner, whether down the line, cross court, chip shot, whatever.
That's right. That's right. Well, ladies and gents, that was law number 8 of Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. We do encourage you to go to livinglikeabank.com, like, subscribe, follow the podcast, share it with a buddy, and learn what you can to educate and empower yourself to build a beautiful legacy, retire with dignity, and just position yourself to, have a safer place for your family in moving forward into these, volatile and uncertain times. So Chris and I thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye for now. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please be sure you subscribe on YouTube or the podcast on anchor.fm and follow me on social media at Metalpreneur. If you're ready to talk about building your own bank, use the QR code or go to rebrand.ly/buildabank. Be sure and join us for the next broadcast as together we learn to live and operate just like the banks do.